Right, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. There we are. Thank you. It's now 15:15. And so if we could begin with the fourth lecture on splendours of the Baroque. We saw some of the Baroque yesterday, of course, but we'll continue on that same mode. And we're beginning with a view of the castle district again, of course. And as I think I mentioned earlier on, the far end of all that complex of buildings surrounding the Cathedral of St. Vitus, where the arrow points to, is in fact a private residence of the Lobkowitz family. And as we shall see in a moment, the Lobkowitz came to power and great significance by the 16th century, and were not only very important in Czech affairs, but they were also one of the great ruling noble families of the empire itself, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And there is still today, but it's no longer owned by them, there's still today in Vienna, the Lobkowitz Palace, painted by the nephew of Canaletto, Bellotto. Now, the palace is now visitable, and it's a very, very fine experience. It's one of those sort of hidden secrets, really, because it's not as popular or not as full of tourists as most other sites in Prague. Well worth going to. Now, the treasures survive by some extraordinary sort of means, really, because the photograph on the bottom left-hand side is of Maximilian Lobkowitz, who fled from the Nazis. He had been a great supporter of Czech nationalism, and of course this was totally against all the principles of the Nazis. So Maximilian fled, apparently just literally in his sleeves, and fled to London, where he was part of the government in exile during the Second World War. He then returns after the Second World War to reclaim his possessions, and of course the Lobkowitz had a good half-dozen great estates in the countryside of the Czech lands, some of which they still own today. But he returns in 1945. Oh, you're in the darkness, is that all right? No. Angus, their complaints. Just sort of half. That's better. That's better. Then you can at least see me, if nothing else. In 1945, Prince Maximilian returns to reclaim his possessions and his lands and so on, only to flee again in 1947 when the communists come to power. And it's therefore surprising that the treasures, which are innumerable, survive, and some very, very, very insignificant treasures. And the present inhabitant of the house is seen on the bottom right, and his name is William. They no longer have the title of prince, although I think many people still call them that, but they still are very, very significant figures in the Czech Republic. And he has, as I say, reclaimed some of his country residences as well. So we're going to have a quick look at the Lobkowitz treasures. And they very much are part of a sort of Baroque era. Now, there is this painting in their possession. It's not a very good painting, but it is historically fascinating because it shows what is an imaginary, not an imaginary scene at all. It shows a real scene, but it's obviously rather fanciful and theatrical. The group of figures on the center and left-hand side of the painting are, of course, the Protestants, who have now thrown those two representatives from Vienna, Martinich and Slavata, and they've thrown thrown them from the windows adjacent to the Vladislav Hall on the 23rd of May 1618, the defenestration of Prague. Now, those men who were thrown from the windows, together with their secretary, were obviously representing the authority of Vienna. They were representing Catholicism. The Czechs were imbued with the Protestant work ethic and Protestant in principle, and they are there protesting, demanding that these two men who had fled, having saved themselves somehow from this precipitous fall from a third floor window, and they sought refuge in the Lobkowitz Palace. And the story goes that the princess of the time, her name is Polyxena, and Polyxena is there standing foursquare, forbidding these Protestant protesters to actually take these two men, and obviously their intention was to slaughter them. So it shows that she's quite a figure to be reckoned with. The story is that she hid them underneath her skirts, but I don't think that is really... I don't think that is feasible at all, but it's a nice story. They love stories, the Czechs, as I say. The treasures are innumerable, and there you can see these two figures of the family as they rise to power and importance and grandeur. The first in Princess Lobkowitz. There's the lady who, what she looked like in reality, the Polyxena, who married Zdeněk, and Zdeněk, in fact, is made the first Prince Lobkowitz and becomes the Chancellor to Rudolf II. We saw Rudolf II yesterday, and subsequently he's Chancellor to Matthias, the Emperor Matthias, and Ferdinand II. Therefore, he was a very major political figure in Bohemia. And he's married to an equally powerful, equally grand, and equally important woman who was a Spanish noblewoman. She's the leader with her husband of what was known then as the Spanish section, the Spanish grouping, which meant that they were the Catholic supporters in opposition to the Protestants. And of course now, after the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, the Catholics are supreme. In the middle, one of the treasures that survives, it is miraculous that these treasures have survived, is the altarpiece which was given as a wedding gift to this couple by the Emperor Rudolf II. So, I mean, that's quite a very significant thing. It's obviously from Florence. It's ebony and pietra dura. It's a small item, little house altar. Now, their treasures are enormous, and here you can see an example of what is tin-glazed earthenware, which is more generally synonymous with Italy, and it could easily be mistaken for Italy, but they think it was actually made in Moravia, which actually makes it even more unique and more valuable. It's a huge dinner service, and these have survived. There's an incredibly important, they say the most important in the world, so a Delft dinner service from the Netherlands. There are obviously Meissen and Sèvres dinner services, all numbering hundreds and hundreds of items, which were somehow carefully kept and carefully preserved through these the tragedies of the of the 20th century. It's called the Perstein service after Polyxena's parents, and you can see the coats of arms there on the coat of arms on the items. What though is the most significant item, which they no longer possess, but they still they still have an association with, is the infant Jesus, or sometimes called the Bambino of Prague, which is incredibly well known throughout the Catholic world. And it was a little doll. It's made of wood. It's not very big. It's about a foot high, even less. And it's made of wood covered in wax. And it has these amazing costumes. And it was given, this little doll, by Polyxena, the first Princess Lobkowitz, to this church, you see, called the Church of Our Lady Victorious. And she's credited with saying, when she gave it to the church, "I bring you my dearest possession. Honor this image and you shall never want." Which was a very sort of far-sighted thing, because of course this church attracts millions and millions of visitors every year because of the miracle-working attributes of this little figure. The church is called Our Lady Victorious. This means the Virgin Mary, who therefore was responsible for the victory of the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620. The church originally was Lutheran, and now, thereafter the battle in 1620, was given to the Carmelite monks. The facade is very typical of Italian early Baroque. There are certain examples in Italy, particularly the Gesù in Rome, which very clearly were the inspiration for this facade and for the interior too. And you can see the arrow on the right-hand side pointing to the place where this little doll is exhibited. And the Blomkowitz family themselves maintain that it has performed miracles for them. You pray to the little child if you have somebody in your family who's ill or who needs care and attention. And the Blomkowitz, they don't say who, but they say that the little child has worked miracles for them, this present family. So it's deeply, deeply venerated, And as I say, amongst any devout Catholic, this would be one of the places, one of the pilgrimages you'd want to make to see the little bambino of Prague, given, as I say, by the first Princess Lobkowitz. And there you can see a detail of it. You can see it has various robes. It is given various robes. Popes give it robes, and very important dignitaries give it robes, and so on and so forth. And it does change its clothes every now and again. And there you can see the surrounds of the little child in this amazing gold decoration. So that's one significant item. Now, excuse me, in the collection today, returned, and in fact from the National Museum, National Gallery of Prague, where it used to be displayed, is an incredibly important painting from the artist Peter Bruegel the Elder. Peter Bruegel was a very, very popular artist, as you know, and still is a universally popular artist. His art seems to appeal to all of us all the time. He's one of these few men who seems to last in popularity through the centuries. And you can see here one of what was a series of 6 paintings. So they were the sort of times of the year. There were 6. We know there were 6 originally. By the latter part of the 17th century, one had disappeared. So there are 5 surviving. There are 3 in the museum in Vienna, the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which is the great gallery, of course, and there's 1 in the Metropolitan Museum of New York, and there's 1 in the Lobkowitz collection, and this is probably amongst the most famous of them. It's the haymaking, it's probably June, July, and this wonderful sense of movement. You can see the people carrying berries or whatever it is on their heads. They're moving off to the right. Those 3 girls striding across to the left. It has a sort of vibrancy, it has a reality, it has something that speaks to all of us. Bruegel seems to have this amazing ability, and he is the creator of this extraordinary art that is so universal. His son will become Peter Bruegel the Younger, and he spends his entire career copying his father, which is rather confusing because there are many versions of these paintings in consequence. But lovely scenes in the background on the bottom left. You can see there's a huge hay wagon being loaded, little churches in the background. The scenery, of course, is totally imaginary. Bruegel painted in Brussels. Belgium is as flat as a pancake, and it doesn't have this sort of scenery. But he makes up the scenery, but gives within it this incredible sense of the universality of life, basically, the reality of life. And I mean, this sort of painting you could see in hospital corridors, you could see in common rooms at universities or whatever. You know, it's the sort of thing that is still so amazingly popular even today. And this painting has been returned to the Lobkowitzes. Similarly here, this is one of a pair. It was a pendant. They were both identical in size, and both of them are in the Lobkowitz collection. They're both of the Thames in London. This moves us forward to the mid-18th century when Canaletto was painting in London. Canaletto, as you probably well know, lived and worked in London for about 10 years, off and on. He got to London in 1746. The reason being, as you well know, was that the tourist numbers had dropped because there was war in Europe, and therefore the war was preventing travel, and so instead of the tourists going to Venice and buying his paintings, Canaletto went to London, where his patrons were, to sell them paintings that he painted in England. And there are a vast number of his paintings that he created in England, but this is probably the most famous. It's about 1750, about 3 or 4 years after he got to London, and it records an actual event. As you see, it's the Lord Mayor's procession down the Thames going to the city of London, and the Lord Mayor's barge is on the far left. I'll show you a detail of that in a moment. Now, this was purchased by the 6th Prince Lobkowitz, a young man. He was still in his 20s. He went to London with, of course, all the prestige, all the money, all the significance, all the sort of importance of being Prince Lobkowitz. And he went as a young man, ostensibly to buy horses to enhance his stud. And he probably did do that, but he also is famous for buying these two paintings. He obviously had a very good eye. I mean, they were very sophisticated men, of course. And he buys these two paintings. The other one is also the Thames, looking towards Westminster Bridge, but this is the more significant one. And he buys these two paintings, and they return and remain now still in the Lobkowitz collection. And you can see here a detail on the left-hand side of the Lord Mayor's barge. And St. Paul's in the background. Oh, by the way, if I went back one, obviously it was an obvious thing to point out, but here, of course, there is London before the modern skyscrapers, and you can see all the sort of 52 Wren steeples in the distance there. So this was lent by William Lobkowitz to an exhibition which took place in 2012 in Greenwich, in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And there is William Lobkowitz with his wife Alexandra, with his mother, who's American. Her name is Brooks Lobkowitz. And they're standing in front of the painting, being introduced to the Queen, because, of course, it was in 2012 that there was enormous celebrations, if you remember, because the Queen was, the United Kingdom celebrated the Queen's 60th year on the throne, her Jubilee. And so she processed down the River Thames, if you remember, and that is the procession which took place in blinding rain, in freezing cold, on the 2nd of June 2012. And if you remember, the Queen and Prince Philip both, well, Prince Philip then was already in his 90s, the Queen was in her late 80s, and they stood for about 5 hours in this bitter, bitter, bitter weather. And they somehow, well, they must be as tough as old boot, I think, really, because they survived. So there you see the comparison at the top between the Canaletto, which looks infinitely more pretty than the procession, sadly, on a terrible, terrible day. I'd watched it. I was in London at the time, and gosh, it was a terrible day, except I watched it for the security and dryness of a flat, so it was all right on the Thames. Anyway, there is the Lobkowitz. Now, their most famous possession, their most significant possession, which obviously is actually without price, it's so important, is the original score of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica. And the reason for this, and that is the original score. I mean, how it survives. I mean, what, you know, the Nazis would have thought would have stolen it and lost it or something, but they didn't. Anyway, this is dedicated to the 7th Prince Lobkowitz, who was the most, well, I don't know, sort of artistic, well, not musical-minded, but the greatest artistic patron, shall we say, a cultural patron, the 7th Prince Lobkowitz. The Third Symphony was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, and it was called Beethoven called it the Bonaparte Symphony originally before its first performance. This title, though, was removed by Beethoven in fury when Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor because then, of course, all his original principles of that people admired were negated by himself, who'd overthrown the rulers of the crowned heads of Europe. He was now crowning himself, and this, of course, was anathema to the liberal-minded people of like Beethoven. So instead of naming it the Beethoven Symphony, he calls it the Eroica Symphony, and he dedicates it to, in 1806, it's composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. Now, does that mean Beethoven? Does that mean Prince Lobkowitz, or does it mean Napoleon? That he leaves in the air. But then you can see in the middle where the arrow points, dedicated, it's all in Italian, dedicated to His Most Serene Highness Prince Lobkowitz, spelt in the German manner. So, I mean, it's pretty well something that to have dedicated to you and still in your possession one of the most famous pieces of music in the world. And so that's a good excuse now to play a bit of the Eroica Symphony. So here you can have. I can't play much of it because it'll take up most of the morning. So I will play a tiny bit from the second movement, which is the fast movement. And it is, I think, must have been made in Canada because there's some nice sort of shots originally of sort of glassy lakes, and there's a big sort of grizzly bear in the water with some seagulls. And then most extraordinarily, there's a frangipani, and then there's a Namaqualand daisy. So it gets a bit muddled up. Anyway, here we are. This is the second movement. Sorry about that. Oh, sorry, there's some fault. Right, so I think, lovely as it is, we can't listen to much more, but I'm sorry about those little gaps. I don't know what so it seemed to play perfectly well when I was on my computer. So yes, the Lobkowitz, therefore, is still a very significant family in Prague, and their connection, as I say, when you next go to Prague, is well worth a visit. And there's a very good audio tour that you can take, which is, again, very interesting and tells you all the interesting facts of the family. So, with the Battle of the White Mountain, with the resurgence of Catholicism and the power emanating then from Vienna, there was a scramble amongst all the noble families to outdo each other in these bigger and better and grander palaces. And this is undoubtedly the biggest palace built by any of these Czech noblemen at the time. His name is Černin, and the Černin Palace is very long and basically very boring. But it's interesting in that it shows the influences coming into the Baroque, into Prague, because the Baroque, of course, is essentially a movement that begins in Italy in the early 1600s It moves to France under the reign of Louis XIV, which is the latter part of the 1600s. And here we get, again, in this period, this is quite clearly, this huge, long facade is influenced quite clearly by the facade of Versailles. But Versailles was also very, very long and very, very boring. And so you can see that there. But what is so interesting, it shows that nothing changes in human nature, this hubris of mankind, that the Count Gerin, who built this palace, obviously determined to build the biggest, grandest, most important palace in Prague, actually spent so much money on it that he never lived in it. And it remained unoccupied, and then has for many centuries been a ministry, a government ministry. So it's no longer in the family or in private hands, but it's a government building. It's a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And rather pleasantly, though, there's a lovely touch. This is a bit of sort of Baroque fantasy, because when you see the upper slide there, when you see the capitals, you would say, oh yes, there's the Corinthian from the Roman influence. And of course they are, but they've got these wonderful gargoyles at the bottom there, which is, I think, really rather amusing, because that is totally, if a Roman saw this, he'd collapse in a heap. It would be, I mean, a real Roman from Roman times. I mean, this is very, very unethical or very real. And it's a nice touch. It's a nice sort of fantasy that still survives. So there is the Czernian Palace. It's on the far left. Opposite it, opposite the Czernian Palace, is the Loreto Monastery, which I'll show a little later, because it is related to the building on the bottom right-hand side, which is St. Nicholas of the Lesser Town. So I'll then go from I've shown you the Czernian Palace. Then there's the Tuscany Palace, which I'll show you briefly, the Archbishop's Palace. I won't show you St. Vitus Cathedral, because we've seen that already, and I'll also show you the Strahov Monastery. And all that is within walking distance. This is the castle district itself. It's all that is within walking distance of each and every one of them. And it is just a melange of the incredible variety and incredible wealth of tremendously great buildings in Prague. I mean, it's just is one example, of course. This is just, and so therefore the castle district itself demands a very long time exposure, because you've got to spend time in the cathedral and, of course, looking at these buildings. The Tuscany Palace gets its name from the fact that it was purchased again. The family who built it went bankrupt, and it was purchased by the Medici from Florence, the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. Interestingly, though, they purchased it in 1718 at a time when actually the Medici were just about to be extinguished. They just were sort of falling out of history, basically. Nevertheless, the name survives. Again, it's a very significant, big, substantial structure with its freestanding porticos and then the little turrets on the top with a statue and so on. It's a very pleasing, and it's obviously, again, French influence. It's by a French architect. But more to my liking, I think this is a very, very pretty building. It's one of my favorite, with this beautiful, pretty facade, which is really almost moving into the Rococo, and the Baroque by the 1760s anyway is at its last stages. It's the Archbishop's Palace, the Archbishop, of course, being the Catholic Archbishop. And just before I forget, on the left-hand side you can see an arch. And through that arch you go down quite a steep little slope to what is another palace adjacent to this one, and the palace that you approach through that arch is the National Museum, the National Gallery, which I mentioned was sort of second 11, but it's still, I mean, if you have the time and you have the interest, it's well worth a visit. The Archbishop's Palace, therefore, is the palace of the Catholic Archbishop, as I say. Inside, and it's very seldom viewable because it still is owned by the Catholic Church, there is a series of magnificent rooms, reception rooms, with superb tapestries. And in fact, those rooms were used, if you remember, for the film of Amadeus, the famous Mozart film written by Peter Schaffer. And they used the interiors of the Archbishop's Palace. It's interesting too that the palace is still lived in by the present Archbishop of Prague, and amongst other functions now. But during the Second World, during the time of the communists, during the communist era. Not initially, but during the period of the communist era, which went, of course, from 1947 to 1989, during that period, the sort of last 20 years or so, the Archbishop in residence was a man called Tomaszek. He was a very powerful man, sort of prepossessing man, and he didn't rebel against the communists like Cardinal Wyszynski did in Poland, who stood up to the communists. But his very presence was significant because they couldn't get rid of him. If they did, they were too nervous about what would happen. And he was just simply there. And he was there year after year, decade after decade. And, excuse me, and then he eventually dies. Just at the fall of communism, almost sort of waiting until that moment, because his role was simply the fact that his presence was such that the communists didn't dare move against the church. And that's why, of course, I mentioned that they did, in fact, to try and counteract the Catholic influence, they rebuilt the Bethlehem Chapel we saw yesterday, which was the chapel in which Jan Hus preached his sermons. And here you can see the palace again with the cathedral in the background. That is St. Vitus, and there is the entrance into the castle itself, into the royal residence, and these two wonderful statues, again wonderfully Baroque, these two figures in movement. They're attacking their enemies with a club and a spear, and they're by a man called Platzer, again late 1770s at the Matthias Gate. Now, obviously, this is the area that you're going to visit if you are in Prague for a short time. You want to go to the cathedral, you want to look at the castle square, and I'll show you three different There's the statues on the left-hand side. You can see they're wonderful statues. There are these extraordinary guards now instituted since the fall of communism. They're rather Ruritanian, I think. And there you can see in 1939, the Nazis driving past in their, whatever they are, motor cars, motoring pieces. And there in 1989, taken in May 1989, when I was there for the Prague Music Festival, except for the soldiers, they don't have their funny little huts now, in those days. They asked two soldiers standing there. There's nobody else in sight in 1989. In 1999, that's what it looked like. And that's what it looks like today. Just shoulder to shoulder people, it's just extraordinary. But they're watching the changing of the guard. For heaven's sake, don't bother, it's not worth it. But anyway, there you are. Now, the Strahov Monastery, again, was disbanded by the communists. It's now been given back to the order of monks who have had it for many centuries. And it has, actually, now that it's been given back to the monks, it's rather difficult to see the interior of the church itself. The church, as you can see, is a long building, because obviously they used it themselves for services. But you do visit these two libraries. And I showed you a library earlier on. And as I say, the multiplicity of great works within and out, the buildings, and then the works within these buildings is fantastic. I mean, that is why Prague is so significant. And so these two monasteries, two libraries. This is called the Theological Hall. It's the most exquisite interior. This wonderful, wonderful, wonderful plasterwork, which, as you see, it's by an Italian called Orsi. The paintings are rather bright, colourful paintings. They're of religious scenes. But you can see again the globes, mainly Dutch. And it dates from this period we're discussing, the late 17th century. 100 years later, is the philosophical hall, which is a very different feel. The earlier one I've just shown you is more sort of romantic. It's got much more decorative feeling to it. This, of course, is after the Baroque. This is more sort of strict and straight and neoclassical and so on. But it has a rather fascinating story when the monastery was building this, as you see in the 1780s, they then found they had no more money. And so it remained a shell until the monks heard about a monastery in the Czech lands somewhere which was being disbanded. And they had a wonderful library. So they thought, what we'll do is buy the shelves and all the fitments from the library, from the monastery that's being disbanded, and re-erect it. Nobody went to check the measurements, though. And it didn't fit. So, and I must say this, I do admire the abbot of the time, because the leader, the man who was in charge, the abbot decided there were two options. Either you cut down the fitments, the shelves and so on, and really sort of then bastardized them, or you rebuilt the library, and that's what exactly he did. He rebuilt the building to fit the shelves. So, and it so therefore survives. And it's two examples. The ceiling is by an Austrian called Maulberch, and it's the spiritual enlightenment of mankind, which is a rather grand subject. So these two libraries in the Strahov Monastery. But what we really want to discuss is the great architect of the Baroque in Prague, and there are many buildings associated with him, called Dietzenhofer, Kilian Ignaz Dietzenhofer. He was born in Prague, but his origins were German. His father came originally from Bavaria. And his father actually worked in Prague, so there are quite a number of buildings which are associated with both father and son. But the son, in this instance, is the greater of the two. He studied initially under his father and then studied, building architecture. There's no such word as an architect in those days, of course. He was a master builder. And he studies in Vienna. And of course, in the early 1700s, when he would have been a young man training, he would have studied in Vienna with the great architects of the period in Eastern Europe, which are the Austrians, Fischer von Erlach, and the other architect whose name I never remember, called Lucas von Hildebrand. And they build the great buildings in Vienna, like the Belvedere, like the Church of St. Charles, and so on and so forth in Vienna. So he was exposed to some of the great influences of the time. And following his father's death, as you see, he rapidly rose to become the most important Baroque architect of the period. And his fame in Prague rests on particularly the ecclesiastical buildings. The Loreto Monastery I'll show you in a minute, St. Nicholas in the Old Town, which won't show you, St. Nicholas in the Lesser Town, which I'll discuss. What's rather fun is that he married twice, and from both marriages together, the total of his children was 16 sons and 7 daughters. It must have been a jolly household, I'd have thought, my God. And actually, rather sadly for him, I would imagine, none of them, not one of them, followed in his footsteps. So there's no subsequent Dietzenhofer who to succeed in the architectural field, that is. And he dies in Prague. His house still survives, but it's not visitable. But it does survive just on the perimeter of the central Prague. So he's a very great man. He looks a rather imposing figure too. Now, the building which is in the area we've just been discussing, adjacent to St. Vitus and so on, is this monastery, the Loreto Monastery. And by the way, it depends on which language you're speaking, on which book you read. You can see the Loreto spelled with 2 T's or 1 T, but in Italy, the Italians spell it with 1 T, and it is an Italian structure or Italian word. So The facade, which is by father and son, you see it 1720s onwards, and therefore Dietzenow would have still been a trainee architect, trainee master builder then. The facade is the epitome of what the Baroque is all about. It's grand, it's imposing, it's strengthful with these columns running along the facade, it's ornamental, all these elaborate statues, and then of course there's a wonderful explosion of the bell tower in the center. It's a building of tremendous significance, really. And the bell tower itself contains in it these 27 bell carillons made by a Danish clockmaker called Naumann, Peter Naumann. And it plays every hour, and I'll play you that in a minute, and he plays what apparently is a song, a Loretan song dedicated to the Virgin, 1,000 times we greet thee. It's not very imposing. I've got this off the net, and it's not very good, I'm afraid, but it's better than nothing at all. Right, so you get an idea. I apologize, not the best of recordings, but still. There you can see in the middle of the courtyard what is the casing, which is a direct copy of the casing which it houses the Virgin's house in Loreto, which is in the marshes of Italy. It's a huge, huge pilgrimage place, very fascinating. The whole foundation of the Loreto was by one of the Lobkowitz family. You can see there, Katharina Lobkowitz, obviously a very devout lady. And so they reconstruct in the middle of this complex the facade, which is very much a sort of high Renaissance structure, which is by a man called Sansovino. And inside there is a replica, in this instance in Prague, in Loreto, what is thought to be the House of the Virgin. It's a little stone structure which has got frescoes on it. It's rather sweet and rather dear. But it was supposedly translated, it was transposed by angels from the Middle East to Loreto, which seems a tiny bit far-fetched, but it's thought probably to have been bought by the Crusaders. And whether it's the House of the Virgin is another matter, but it still is deeply venerated. And it was, as I say, in this instance, one of these noble ladies paid for the whole complex. Today it's a museum, and inside, where those shiny windows are in the back beneath the tower, is an incredible display of religious objects. Particularly monstrances. A monstrance is a great elaborate structure which you hold up, the priest holds up to the congregation, within which is the center usually, which could contain the holy bread or can contain a relic, and it's to display, to demonstrate the monstrance. And the most famous of these monstrances is this one here, which is designed by one of these great Viennese architects or designers, Fischer von Erlach, John Baptist Fischer von Erlach, and it's made by two Viennese goldsmiths in 1698. There's the actual rock crystal center in which you would display either the holy bread or a relic of sorts. It's gold-plated silver and weighs 10 kilograms. And contains 6,222 diamonds. It's rather beautiful. That's a lovely detail that you can see. And this is one of many of these objects in the museum itself, in the Loreto Monastery. 6,222, all given by one lady. It was her diary from her husband, her wedding present from her husband. Try that out and see what happens. So now we look down upon the Church of St. Nicholas in the lesser town. As I mentioned, the lesser town is this very, very lovely, characteristic environment which descends down the slope towards the river. And it's where, as I say, the artisans and the hangers-on, the various courtiers and so on would live when the castle itself was a royal residence. And it still has wonderful buildings. A lot of embassies are in this area and so on and so forth today. And some very good palaces too. But the major sort of feature is, as you can see there, the dome and the bell tower. And there you can see it again below. There's the facade and the dome of St. Nicholas of the Lesser Town, or in the Lesser Town. It's by father and son, by the Dietzenhoffers. And the facade is world famous. It's the epitome of the Baroque. The Baroque has to be strengthful. The Baroque must be powerful. But at the same time, it must be in movement. And you can see here, there's actually very few straight lines. It bends backwards and forwards across the facade. Then you've got the straight lines going vertically. But you've got this wonderful sense of movement. And the facade bends inwards and outwards. It's like a ripple. It ripples across, which is and then at the top there you've got the gable, the sides of the gables and so on, the pediment and whatever. It's a wonderful work with the staircases below cascading out. So there's endlessly something to look at, endlessly something to interest you. It's not just a plain structure which is you can read for instantly. It's a work that invites you in. It's a work that encourages you to examine it further. And then, of course, the statuary as well, which enhance the whole sort of theatricality. The Baroque always is theatrical and intends to be. And you see there this facade, which then anticipates what is to come inside. So it takes quite a long time to be built, 60 years or so. And the last item to be built is the bell tower, which is on the far right-hand side of the illustration, which is actually by an Italian called Lurago. But the church itself is these two men, Christoph and Kilian Dietzenhofer. Today you have to pay if you want to go inside, which is all well and good because it keeps the vast numbers of tourists down a little bit anyway. And there's the interior. The Baroque uses paint, the Baroque uses emotion, the Baroque uses all sorts of items to encourage you to participate, to be part of this great environment. And I've shown the plan there because although obviously there's a straight aisle with side chapels, which is very Italian actually, the actual chapels, as you see, sort of curve inwards and outwards. They move all the way around. It's like a wave patterning, which is part of the whole spirit of this movement. And this really is one of the prime examples of the Baroque. It's late. It's 100 years or more than 100 years, 150 years after Bernini, well, 100 years after Bernini in Rome. But it is one of the great works of the Baroque anywhere on earth, actually. And wonderful for concerts, if you can go to one. They sometimes have them these days. There's the ceiling. It is dedicated to St. Nicholas. Of course, St. Nicholas is Santa Claus, St. Nicholas who gives gifts to the poor. And there he's being wafted heavenwards. Again, in a wonderful painted ceiling by a local man called Kraka. Huge, and you can see there what I mean by the movement. The ceiling is reflecting the movement of the nave as it curves its way round and about. And then again, the high altar with the actual space in front of the high altar where the participants would be is surrounded by these 4 huge statues. I mean, they must be 4 times life size. They're absolutely enormous. They're made of wood. They look as if they're marble. The whole thing is deception. The whole thing is theatric. And then there are four fathers of the Eastern Church. And then at the back, you have the actual altar itself, the high altar, which shows St. Nicholas. And on each side, because it is a Jesuit church, or was originally a Jesuit church, there's the founder of the Jesuit order, St. Ignatius Loyola, on the left-hand side, and St. Francis Xavier, who went to Christianize the Japanese and didn't do very well there, is on the right-hand side. I think it's Francis Xavier who is actually buried eventually in Goa. If any of you have been to Goa, I think it's St. Francis Xavier, a wonderful tomb there. And so I'm rather proud of that photograph. I thought it was rather good. And there is St. Nicholas. He's being given, don't you look at that lovely little putty there. He's standing on his tiptoes, holding his tray, and he's got 2 buns on the tray. St. Nicholas has taken the 3rd. There's little spikes by the way to prevent pigeons coming and roosting on them. There he's got the 3rd bun. And because he will give the buns away, I think perhaps he's putting the 3rd bun on the tray, because then the buns will be given away to the poor. And you see, it's all in movement. Angels, little putti standing up, flying putti going backwards and forwards. It's got this amazing sense of vibrancy and reality, which, or irreality actually. It's sort of the whole sense of the Baroque movement is there encapsulated. But, as I say, by the 1780s, you're going to find the reaction. The reaction began much earlier in France. The reaction to the Baroque began in France in about the 1750s, certainly by 1760. Here in 1780, you now have much more the strength and severe classical balance again of the neoclassicism. And this is one of the great treasures of Prague, because it's one of these unique example, not unique, but one of these very rare examples of an original theatre surviving today in its former state. It's called the Estates Theatre, although there are periods of its existence when it was called the Nostitch Theatre, because it was actually designed, paid for by a man called Count Nostitch. And so it rightly was called the Nostitch Theatre, but nowadays it's called the Estates Theatre. It is absolutely exquisite inside, and it survives intact as it was created in the 1780s. And you can see it, that's in the evening light. Here you can see it in the daylight. It's not tiny, but it's certainly modest for a modern theatre. And it's where Mozart's Don Giovanni was first performed on the 29th of October, 1787. You can see here, that's the interior. And rather nicely, I remember once going on a tour. It was on one of those music tours when I took, in 1989, when I took tours. I don't do tours anymore, but please don't ask me, because I don't do them. But I was on this music tour. There were 2 wonderful ladies from Cape Town actually on the tour. We went to have a view of this. We went on a private morning just to have a look inside, and there's this lovely gentleman who was quite elderly, probably half my age, but I mean he was quite elderly, and he showed us round with a lovely twinkle in his eye, because don't forget, in 1989, communism was just on its last legs, and he said that the authorities, that is the communist authorities, had given money for the redecoration of this theatre. Because although it survives, obviously you need to get new velvet for the seats and so on and so forth. And so the discussion took place as to what colour this should be. I mean, Covent Garden is red, but they thought that red was too emotive a colour under communism. They didn't want to have red, and so they took the decision to actually, sort of, as it were, cock a snoop with the communists. They chose green instead, and they had a green interior because they certainly didn't want red with the communists in power. So Don Giovanni's first performed there, and also in 1834, a man called Till, who's not the really greatest known figure in music, had a play performed in which there was an aria called "Where Is My Home?" And that, in fact, is now the Czech national anthem. And I'll play it to you tomorrow because it's a very beautiful song, actually. Well, you've heard it already on the first morning. So just to end with, you're going to hear the Overture to Don Giovanni. It's got a lot to do with Prague, because Prague, by the way, was Mozart's favourite city.